Chapter 19. "This is really creepy." Deirdre glanced over at me and snorted. "You haven't seen the half of it." Her response did nothing to abate the crawling dread which had washed over me since making the early morning traffic-free drive from my apartment to my new home away from home, the Mall of America. Pulling into the starkly empty parking ramp had sent the first shiver down my spine. Usually packed to the corners, at this hour of the morning, there were only a few random cars spread haphazardly out across the large space, each one quietly hulking in and out of dim pools of light. I wondered for a moment how long Howard Singleton's body had remained undiscovered in his car after the robbery, which had left him strangled and slumped over the front seat. This train of thought inspired me to wonder if any of these other cars were currently playing host to a corpse or two. With that new thought in my mind, I increased my pace and made wide arcs around the empty cars as I scurried out of the ramp. Standing at the designated door was less unnerving, but only a little. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long, as Deirdre responded to my text of "I'm here" with unusual promptness. As she opened the locked door for me, I thought she might immediately fill me in on the specifics of this late-night outing, but after her brief response to my comment about the creepy quotient, she had been otherwise tight-lipped. I followed her back into the building, figuring all would be explained sooner than later. I was used to seeing these hallways crammed with people and all the storefronts brightly lit up, so I was really unnerved by how dark and quiet the mall was in the wee hours. As we made our way down a long, dark, silent corridor, I turned occasionally to be sure no one was behind us. No one was, but despite these frequent checks, it continued to feel as if we were being followed or stalked. My shoes squeaked on the tile, and I wondered if they always made that sound, but I was only realizing it now because of the lack of other ambient noise. We continued to walk in semi-silence as I tried, unsuccessfully as it turned out, to minimize my shoe squeak with each step. This mindless task took my thoughts off my overall feeling of dread, but only to a small and not too helpful degree. The eeriness factor took a tenfold leap when we rounded a corner and stepped into the amusement park in the center of the large mall. The huge space was lit almost entirely by moonlight from the atrium windows high above. The old-fashioned streetlights lining the fake cobblestone pathways gave off a sickly and wholly unhelpful yellow glow. Some of the rides were outlined in dim, twinkly lights, but the park as a whole was bathed in murk, crowded with odd shadows and patchy dark corners. A sharp turn in the twisty trail revealed a bright, glowing area in the midst of the gloom. As we approached the front of Babe's barn, I could see that large work lights had been hastily set up, bathing the front of the cartoonish structure in more light than it had been designed to be viewed under. What was playful and fun in the light of day took on a stark, garish feel under this too bright glare. The harsh lights threw weird shadows on the large display of photos under the sign, "Capture a Memory with Babe." I glanced over at the light stands to see Homicide Detective Fred Hutton in conversation with two uniformed Bloomington cops, along with a couple other figures. I shifted my position slightly to get a better view and realized he was talking to the security guy, Brock, and one other person. Taking a step to my left, I recognized it was Mort Fleischman. Deirdre headed straight to the display of photos, which showed dozens of images of kids happily smiling for the camera while sitting on Babe the Blue Ox's lap. In the photos, Babe was seated in an oversized log chair which had been placed in front of a woodsy backdrop. Although the kids were all different, Babe and the background were identical in every shot. "What do you know about the process of getting your photo taken with Babe the Blue Ox?" Deirdre asked, as she turned to me from the photo display. Nothing too specific, as I've never done it, I said. You pay your money and stand in line, I guess. Must be pretty popular, as there's always a line. As I've come to recently learn, it's very popular. So much so, she said as she began to walk through the large front doors into the barn, that at any one time there can be as many as 3 Babe the Blue Oxes in the barn providing photo ops. I wasn't quite sure what she meant. You mean on rotation? I followed her into the barn's small lobby. She shook her head. No, simultaneously. Now I was really lost. How does that work? It's sort of clever, actually. Each small group goes through this main door here, she said, as she walked toward a door with a large cartoon caption over it, which read, "This way to see Babe." She opened the door, and we stepped into another, more rustic-looking inner lobby area with a large fireplace and other pastoral flourishes. A door on the left was outlined in twinkle lights, while a sign on the center of the door flashed, "Babe, can't wait to see you." Deirdre walked to that door and opened it, revealing a wood-paneled corridor which snaked off toward the back of the barn. She shut the door, and immediately the lights around the door and the flashing sign snapped off. An instant later, lights appeared around another door on the right side of the lobby, along with its own "Babe, can't wait to see you" flashing sign. I hadn't seen the door when we came in, as it artfully faded into the background without the flashing lights. I looked over at the first door, which now had nearly disappeared into the woodwork. Deirdre crossed the small lobby and opened and closed the door on the right. The moment it was shut, its lights went off and another set of lights popped on next to the fireplace, revealing a third door. It had been there all along, but was really only evident once its framing lights were switched on. Like the other 2 doors, it sported its own "Babe, can't wait to see you" sign. I looked at the 2 other doors, both which had smoothly receded into the walls around them, and then back at the newly lit door. This may be the best magic trick in the park, and this is coming from a guy opening a new magic show in, I glanced at my watch, in way too few hours from now. Yeah, 3 doors, 3 hallways, 3 different photo rooms. It's a clever way to give each customer the illusion that there's only one Babe the Blue Ox, and he's waiting just for you, Deirdre said, when in fact, you could end up with any one of 3. This is our door. She opened the newly lit door and headed down the hallway. I followed, my thoughts now split between what we were about to see and my nervousness over my impending magic debut. I did my best to put that out of my head, but I needn't have bothered, as moments later, all thoughts of magic left my body. My dinner almost joined them. I should warn you, this is a bit gruesome, Deirdre said, as we made our way down the hallway, which was lined on either side with dark wood paneling. Up ahead, I could see our destination was brightly lit and teeming with people. The small photo studio had an immediately familiar feel to it, but I quickly realized it was because one entire wall was the same woodsy backdrop that had appeared in all the photos I'd seen in the display out front. In the center of the backdrop was a large wooden chair, and seated in the chair was Babe the Blue Ox. That is, Babe the Blue Ox on his worst day ever. Seated in the chair was Dave, last name unknown, whom I had spoken to during his smoke breaks down at the south loading dock. His eyes were wide, but he was clearly dead. The most obvious indication being the color of his face, which was nearly as blue as his costume. The head for the costume lay at his feet, and a crime scene tech was in the midst of using scissors to cut the rest of the costume off the deceased performer. One other detail stood out in this decidedly odd tableau. Dave's mouth and nose were covered in gray duct tape. "He's smothered inside his suit?" I asked Deirdre quietly as another crime scene tech, this one taking photos, stepped in front of us for a new angle. "That's the premise we're working from," she said. "Why didn't he just take off his head and remove the tape?" I asked. "He couldn't move," she said, gesturing to the tech with the scissors, who was starting to work on one of the costume arms, which rested stiffly on the chair. "He was trapped inside the costume, and the headpiece and the rest of the costume were glued to the chair." "Glued to the chair?" I repeated, not sure I'd heard the words correctly. "Glued, and in some cases, stapled. We're not sure what type of epoxy was employed, but yeah, he was essentially stuck to the chair, unable to move," Deirdre said, moving to the left to stay out of the photographer's way. "They taped his mouth and nose shut, then glued him to the chair, and there he sat." "You mean he struggled to get out all day?" Deirdre shook her head. "No, I imagine he succumbed quite quickly. For all its faults, suffocation is a pretty efficient way to get the job done. I'm just saying, after he died, his body sat there all day." It took a long moment for the reality of this information to settle in on me. "You mean," I began slowly, "he was dead in the chair all day, and they continued to take photos the entire time?" "As best we can tell, yes," Deirdre said. She turned and indicated the high-tech cameras setup which faced the chair and its tableau. "Fred has a call into the photographer for this room and is talking to the director of operations right now. But our understanding is that today was a typical day of photography here in Babe's studio number 2. "Typical for everyone but Dave," I said. Deirdre looked over at me. "That answers question 1. So you did know him?" "Well, I knew his name was Dave," I said, remembering Morgan had identified him from my description. "I've only talked to him a couple of times. He used to take smoke breaks down at the south loading dock." "Because the surveillance camera doesn't work down there," Deirdre added. "So he said." "How very convenient for Dave," she murmured. "Anything else you remember about him?" "One thing stands out," I said. "The last time I saw him, he said this weird thing as I ran by him." "You ran by him?" I realized I had not provided sufficient context, which was not an uncommon issue in our relationship. "As part of the act, I have to make a quick run from below the stage, down past the loading docks, and then up some stairs. Then I magically burst into the theater through the main door." "I'll just bet you do," she said, doing a lousy job of suppressing a smile. "Anyway, the last time I saw him, he said something about how he was going to be rich. Something like that. I'm not entirely sure what he meant." She considered this and was about to reply when a loud ripping noise behind us indicated the tech was just about finished cutting Dave out of his costume. "Let's get out of here and give them room to work," she said, turning toward the door. "You don't have to ask me twice," I said. I glanced over at the tableau just in time to see Dave's body freed from the confines of his costume as he pitched forward. The tech tried to catch him, but all he was really able to do was slow the inevitable fall. Now that he was no longer glued to the chair, gravity was able to do its job and pulled the body with surprising speed directly toward the floor. I heard it land with a sickening thud just as we cleared the doorway. Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was just finishing a phone call as Deirdre and I exited Babe's barn. A sharp and not too subtle head jerk on his part brought the two together for a quick and private conference. Recognizing I was not part of the silent invitation, I stood awkwardly in front of Babe's barn. 2 Bloomington cops were taking notes while talking to Brock and Mort Fleischman, while other official crime scene folks came and went in what felt like a steady stream. This may have been one for the record books, and I think lots of people who otherwise didn't need to be here were stopping by to see it firsthand. With nothing else to do while I waited, I took another opportunity to examine the sample photos plastered by the entrance to the barn. Even with my new awareness that the pictures had been shot in 3 different but identical studios, there was no obvious indication of this sleight of hand on view. The backgrounds were the same, and each Babe the Blue Ox was indistinguishable from the others, with no noticeable variation in size or position. The only thing that changed from photo to photo was the kids. After reviewing the entire display, it was clear that these photos had obviously been chosen for the level of excitement and delight the kids were demonstrating. There wasn't an unhappy or crying child in sight. As I studied the photos, it occurred to me that all the pictures taken today with the murdered Dave would essentially be identical to these images. The performers were not allowed to talk to the children, so no one would be aware that the Babe the Blue Ox in a third of today's photos was dead at the time the image was snapped. That is, unless someone told them. And since it was a murder, it was pretty clear the word would get out at some point. I wasn't sure how the mall would spin this crime with parents, most of whom, I assumed, wouldn't want to add a photo of their kids sitting on a dead guy's lap to the family photo album or next year's Christmas card. If nothing else, I was guessing they would offer a free photo sitting, this time with a living, breathing performer. Fred talked to the photographer for Studio 2, Deirdre said. Her ad hoc conference with her husband concluded. He had followed her over to where I stood, placing himself just far enough away to hear the conversation without having to actually take part in it. She was pretty shaken up to hear she'd been photographing a corpse all day. Certainly not part of the standard job description. I don't think this even falls under the other duties as assigned clause that's so popular, I agreed. But didn't it seem strange to her that he didn't move all day? Deirdre shrugged. Apparently, the two of them have sharply differing political views. She said it wasn't uncommon to work together all day without exchanging a word. So she was giving him the silent treatment and was under the mistaken impression he was giving it right back, I offered. Deirdre nodded. Something like that. I shook my head sadly. Poor guy. The one time he could actually win a silent treatment skirmish, and he had to die to do it. I glanced at Deirdre and then over at homicide detective Fred Hutton. When we were married, sometimes I used to pray for the silent treatment. I'm sure you know what I mean, I added, catching and holding homicide detective Fred Hutton's gaze for longer than he appeared to welcome. I'm sure I don't, he said, but his answer came a split second too late and was missing his usual tone of confidence and condescension. Anyway, Deirdre said as she pulled the conversation back in the direction she wanted it to head, the photographer said she took 2 coffee breaks and a lunch break. Dave was always there when she left and there when she got back. So she just assumed he was avoiding her. I nodded, not sure I had anything worthwhile to add to the conversation. At times like these, I had found it best to remain silent and let Deirdre take the lead. There's something weird about this murder, she finally said, a clear tone of frustration in her voice. Do you think? She was so deep in thought my sarcastic tone was completely wasted on her. I mean, in conjunction with the other murders, she continued. She turned to her husband. They just don't add up. He moved toward us, still not breaking the invisible conversational bubble which normally surrounds people in chatting mode. We have 2 shootings, he said as he glanced unnecessarily at his notes, both with the same gun, very simple, very direct. And if it's connected, which we're still not sure it is, We have the robbery and strangulation in the parking ramp, Deirdre said. The killer hid in the back seat and basically jumped the victim from behind. Nothing too bizarre there. And now this freak show, I added, gesturing to Babe's barn behind us. I'm not even sure how you'd classify this one. I think you hit it right on the money with freak show, Deirdre said. She glanced at her husband, and something silent passed between them. Look, Eli, Fred and I have talked. You've done a great job on this, and we really appreciate it. But you can bow out if you want. I'm not sure, we're not sure, there's any more you can add. And we don't want to see you get hurt. I appreciate and share that sentiment, I said. But, as weird as it sounds, I have 8 shows to do tomorrow. Today, actually. And I'm going to be very disappointed with myself if I don't go through with them. I've worked hard to get to this point, and I really want to see it through. Deirdre started to say something, but I held up my hand and effectively cut her off. You have my promise. I will stay out of harm's way and keep my head down and just do the shows. In fact, I'll do the first one of them in just about... I looked down at my watch and sighed at the exhausting reality which stared at me in the face. In just about 5 hours, I'm sad to say. So, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to head home and attempt to get at least a couple hours of sleep. The very thought produced an unprovoked yawn on my part, so I simply gave them a wave and headed down the steps in front of Babe's barn toward the exit. As I got to the edge of the amusement park, I turned for one last look. Deirdre was on her phone, and Homicide Detective Fred Hutton was back in conversation with Brock and Mort Fleischman while the Bloomington cops listened in. Just as I was about to turn away, Fleischman snuck a glance in my direction. We locked eyes. I'm no mind reader, but his expression seemed to say, Hey, isn't that the new magician I just hired? And if it is, why is he out here in the middle of the night? And why was he deep in conversation with those cops after a bizarre, brutal, and grisly murder in Babe's barn? Or he might have been thinking nothing at all. But the most significant fact about the way he looked at me was, for virtually the only time since I'd met him, Mort Fleischman made actual, sustained eye contact with me. He held my gaze for several uncomfortable seconds, and then he returned to his conversation with the police while my squeaky shoes and I headed toward the exit and my car.